Now. Good evening. This is this Orthodox Apologetics Live. As always, this is Deacon Joseph, and
this is Hieromonk Enoch.
Okay, and we're ready to begin the show. So, all right. What questions do we have to start with? Let's see. We got one just now, and that is it says, "What is the precism Western teaching on clerical beards?"
Oh, by the late 10th and the immediate 11th century, there was generally kind of a negative attitude to having long clerical beards in the West. I mean, you would find it among hermits and monks and things like that, but there was, I guess, they developed a negative attitude.
Well, I know that there were,
and it had to do with like celebrating Mass every day, and for example, there was this text from the late 800s in France that discussed the question of beards for monastic clergy, and and one side in the text was saying that the beard should be kept short and the mustaches should be heavily trimmed because you're taking communion every day as a priest celebrating liturgy. And the other side said, well, St. Anthony and St. Benedict, had longer beards and such. They never, I don't recall the text ever coming to an exact conclusion, but do you have anything to add, Father Joseph?
Well, I was going to say that in the earliest text, and also if you look in those later texts, it talks about cutting the hair and the beard short, but it never talks about cutting them off. So the idea that you're supposed to be clean shaven, I'm not sure what the origin of that is altogether. I'm not sure where it introduced itself, but the idea of short hair and short beards is not necessarily foreign to Orthodoxy, whether East or West, but the whole idea of completely being shorn, which would, if I remember the earliest text giving the appearance of a woman, that wasn't permissible.
Yes. Okay. Any more questions?
Well, I don't see any other questions for right now. Justice for Orthodoxy, I hope that answers your question. And let's see here. And we're going to go.
Well, let me point out, there was, just to make a little bit more elaborate, it would be kind of incorrect to say that there was some kind of dogmatic teaching they had. He says the precism Western teaching. It might be more the opinions of different figures about it, I guess. So.
Oh, okay. Hold on. I was trying to remember what questions we had last week. One of the ones that popped up, and I'm going to give a shout out to Dustin Lacko on this because he did ask me that over the weekend. And hold on. Let me see here. Okay, and that was back on Friday. Dustin Lecco asked, I see the thorny issue of usury came up in your show. I really haven't heard a good answer as to how this applies to our modern economic system, which is basically built upon and revolves around interest being paid on loans. I haven't heard anyone from Orthodoxy really explain it. There seems to be a lot of gray area with the whole issue. In the first place, oh, go ahead, Father.
The problem is that the Orthodox answer would be that the current economic system may be not good, and that it may need to be completely revamped.
Now, that's an interesting thing, because now one of the things that we were going to talk about on this show is that we're making other shows. And this is technically not actually an apologetics question, but it's still a very important question. So, the question of, how do you live usury free in a society that's literally built around usury? I think it's a good question. It's something that needs to be asked. But intersections of orthodoxy and society. We were talking about introducing another show for all these they're more general, they're less apologetics and defending the faith questions, but they're still relevant questions to orthodoxy today and to Orthodox Christians today. So that's something that we want to, we definitely.
I think it should be pointed out that if you're talking about like a bank account, maybe this is, I don't deal too much with bank accounts, but the last time I had a bank account was several years ago, and it was because I needed to have a driver license and all that other stuff to get it right. But unless you keep on putting money into a bank account, even if you just leave like $50 in a bank account or $200, that actually gets drained. So you're not even. I didn't even see how I was even collecting interest in a bank account or even a savings account in some cases.
And with savings accounts, a lot of the time you have to keep what's known as a minimum balance in order to get interest, and if you don't keep that minimum balance, it drops down. Like
Well, my point is that what happens if like there's inflation? Are you really even collecting interest then?
Well, yeah, and if there's inflation, well, first off, interest almost never matches the rate of inflation, so there's always an arbitrage opportunity for the banks. So it's if your interest rate is 1.5% and inflation is at 1.7, then guess what? The bank is still making money off you. So it's a really tricky question. Because it's true, the modern American economic system, whether we look at college education all the way to like buying a house, everything is based around loans and interest, and everyone's on credit cards. Credit cards carry interest rates.
Well, I think there might be a difference between someone charging you interest and you have no choice but to accept it, as opposed to you charging interest. I mean, do you think? If somebody's like trying to take advantage of the system and affect you, you can't really. I mean, to some degree, how are you supposed to fight back against that? You cannot charge interest, but people can abuse you through the interest system.
Well, the way you would do that is you would avoid those that would charge interest.
Yes,
you would use something considered like you would use like fee-based systems, and I know that this is totally not apologetics based.
Well, I don't know. Maybe it is apologetics, because this does deal with issues that are found in the canons and in the early teachings of the early fathers.
Yeah,
they do address the interest question, and this is actually, believe it or not, a question that's been talked about a lot for the past few hundred years.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting because of the fact that first off, interest as we know it existed all the way in the time of the gospel, and we know that because of the parable of the talents, where basically the unworthy servant, basically who doesn't do anything with the money, he just digs it in the ground, the master basically says, you could have at least put it in the bank and I could have collected interest. The point is that, the use of interest is not necessarily, it's just Christians should not be charging each other that way. So
a Christian shouldn't even charge another person interest, because remember, the ancient Old Testament law was that Israelites could not charge each other interests, but they could charge foreigners interest. And there was a reason why. I think St. Ambrose and St. Augustine, St. Chrysostom talk about this. They say the reason the Israelites were allowed to charge non-Israelites interest, the reason was? It was considered a weapon of war and financial attack.
That's interesting.
Because the concept was the Israelites were going to be at war with basically, like the Philistines and all these other groups. So, you're going to use whatever means you have in the war, because the Philistines were going to do the same thing. Now, I'm not sure if they were allowed to charge interest to the Moabites or the Ammonites or the other groups that were technically considered related to them. But the concept was that if you're at war with somebody, you could use whatever means you can to, whether military or financial, to attack them. So the fathers interpreted the allowance of interest to enemies of Israel in the Old Testament to be not an endorsement of interest as a positive good any more than the endorsement of using a sword to attack your foe in war was to endorse the sword as this wonderful, great thing. It was considered a weapon of war. So if interest is then considered in the realm of a deadly weapon, then not only should Christians not use it against each other, we shouldn't really use it. We shouldn't really use it against even our enemies, because we're supposed to be we're supposed to love our enemies. Now there is a certain extent to which the state has to protect people and such, but. And I'm just saying is that there's so much about the world today that is completely incompatible with Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah.
So we're having to live in a world that is extremely hostile to Orthodoxy. I mean, even it was only no more than 100, 120, 130 years ago, they still at least used to have kind of usury laws. I think they even still have them on the books in many places.
Yeah.
And usury was not even, I don't know, I don't like Thomas Jefferson so much, but I still remember some of his writings where he attacked finance capitalism. Calhoun did it, as usurious and all this other stuff back in the early 19th and late 18th century.
Well, this was part of the reason that for at least the first, 150 years of the U.S.'s history, they relied primarily on precious metals for backing as opposed to debt. But in any case, that goes way past what we were talking about.
But the point is that usury is not allowed in Orthodox Christianity.
Right. You can't create an Orthodox banking system based on interest. It won't work. Yes.
Now, there are other things around that about creating banks based upon non-usurous systems, and there's a lot of writings on those that are not by Orthodox Christians, but they're out there. So, Truth is Clean, or Verum S. Mundum, asks, trying to decide between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, going through RCIA with the local Catholic Church, but still researching Orthodoxy. I hope to make a decision within the next 6 months. What do you think about that, Father?
Well, I was actually writing back. We're here to help with every question. So if he has questions, or if you have questions, please just feel free to ask. It's the thing is, apologetics is about giving. It's about giving a ready answer to anyone who asks, and that's why we can diverge into other topics, which we're going to create another show for. But in terms of learning which one is the true faith, I mean, there's no question you should be afraid of. And so, I think that's something that has been lost. Yes, there are things that are issues of faith. So we don't,
Now, on the war zone, the question came up about, this one person asked about, the schism between the East and the West in 1054. You remember what was being asked, right, Father? Yeah,
that basically, it was, again, it goes into that whole common historical theory that there was this gradual estrangement that took place from the 7th to 8th centuries and didn't really solidify until the sack of Constantinople in 1204. It completely neglects the fact that there was an internal schism in the West, and that one side of that schism would create the foundations for what would be the Roman Catholic Church. Again, you could watch Who Invented the Roman Catholic Church. We're gonna do more on that. We should probably do another video explaining it in more detail. But the idea that this gradual estrangement theory exists only in the service of ecumenism. It's basically it's coded language to say basically that really both sides kind of had the truth and both sides kind of lost the truth, and we're all getting it back. And that's not reality. That's not what happened. So,
but a lot of well-meaning people oftentimes accept the theory without necessarily intending to.
It's in college textbooks, of course. It's not their fault that they're getting bad information. But the only way to combat bad information is with good information. And by good, I mean with information of quality, not tertiary sources based on secondary sources based on flawed research. You have to ask the real questions.
And address and go through primary source material yourself.
Mm-hmm. You have to look at primary sources always.
There was another question someone had asked from another forum, but I brought it up on the War Room about the old believers. Okay. And it was, why shouldn't we consider the old believers a legitimate church? And my simple answer was that basically the old believers claimed to be the true church, and they didn't have bishops for 150 years. So, if you claim to be the true church, you're not like you're in communion with some true church, but you're the only true church, and you don't have bishops for like 150 years. As far as I'm concerned, that delegitimizes your claim immediately. All right. So that's why I've never given much. There's sympathetic things about the old believers. They got persecuted, but now that just because people get persecuted doesn't mean everything they said or did was right. It just means the persecution was bad. The old believers did crazy stuff like immolate themselves. People kind of never talk about that a lot. They kind of did, and they turned into kind of crazy organizations and things.
Well, yeah, my favorite one is the group of old believers who stopped using icons and began worshiping God through a hole in the wall. I mean, what?
Well, those are the ones who rejected all priests entirely.
Yeah, but the point I'm trying to make is that there were loads of the partially married. Old believers.
Well, you know why that happened? That happened because technically they were like, only a priest can do a marriage. Well, we don't have priests, so what are we going to do?
And there was I forget which Russian author it was who was writing about a particular sect of old believers, and it's just the point is that
I knew a few years ago, I talked to one of our priests, and he had I guess gone through part of the Russian seminary system. In Rokor, and some other stuff. Anyway, he had studied Russian history, but one of the things he mentioned was that if you look at Russia in the 1600s, in a lot of these rural areas and such, a lot of the knowledge of the people was they didn't see a priest oftentimes within sometimes in years, or maybe once a year. That was a major problem, and that a lot of times you could just have somebody kind of like claim to be an ascetic. He'd go off into the woods, and then everybody's like, "Oh, he's a holy man." You know what I mean? I mean, that was kind of one of these like wandering pilgrim type things that would happen in Russia. You know?
Yeah.
And so that was kind of a building up issue that Russia had for some time. And so once you get the Niconian schism, not Niconian, but the Old Believer schism during the Niconian period happened, you know, all these underground problems just kind of exploded. You know, you had whole villages of people that are like, well, we don't see a priest except maybe once a year or every 2 years. And they had to have their elders do baptisms anyway. So they thought, well, the heck with priests, you know? And, you know, they created all these weird, you know, type organizations and groups and things like that. And it, you know, and it just, you know, was, I mean, the Russian church, to be honest, and the czars, they did exacerbate the situation. I mean, that is true. I mean, especially under Peter the Great. I mean, they didn't help. Yes, exactly. And I mean, there were some things they tried to do in the late 1600s. And then there were some things in the Petrine reforms that weren't entirely bad. For example, one of the things they tried to do in the Petrine reforms was try to say there were these cases in which you'd have like one Russian chapel in a village, and there'll be like 200 people in the village. All right. But you'd have like 15 priests at one you know, chapel for 200 a church for 200 people. But then you'd have like another village that have like 500 people, but you know, basically one priest or no priest. So they tried to disperse the priests, and they said, well, for every one priest, you know, it has to be like a 300-to-1 ratio for priest to people or something like that. But that also backfired because, you know, priests were entirely overworked, you know. So even when they tried to do a correct reform in the Petrine period, they ended up kind of exacerbating the situation.
Yeah.
So, but again, I think when you're dealing with the Old Believer, I don't know. Have you ever dealt with Old Believers when you were in Russia, Father?
Well, not really, and I'll tell you because Old Believers in general, most of the Old Believer communities were pretty insular. There were very few cases of Old Believer individuals who were living in the city for work and stuff like that.
What about the Old Believers who run the YouTube channels and have the videos of the Old Believer liturgies and things?
Well, yeah, but you know, I mean, I think that there's to some degree that's kind of a romanticized Old Believer life. But the point is,
but there are Old Believers running YouTube channels with doing videoing things. And
yeah, I don't doubt that. And I'm saying that a lot of the times they live in the cities and stuff like that, and so on and so forth. But then they go back and they film their village stuff, and it's just, you know, the thing is, it's not or you know, it could just be old right people, you know, under the Belokranitsi or something like that. I don't doubt that. But
Belokranitsi hierarchy is Old Believer. Remember, the majority of the Old Believers are the priestly Old Believers, either part of the Pellegrinitsa hierarchy or that other hierarchy that was formed in the 1920s from the Renovationist bishops.
Right.
Such.
So, yeah, I mean, the question of, you know, again, usually the priest and Old Believers, their beliefs are no different than that of the Orthodox, and so they usually...
Except they do have theoretical problems with how they explain the church existed for 150 years. That was my point.
Right, and that's why, you know, but with the Enoch, that's not even an issue.
Oh, so, no. Well, yeah, exactly. With Edo Noveri, they just well, I guess we were wrong. Can we be part of it? Can we have our right now? You know, that was all.
And if you take the Belokranitsi, of course, because they got their ordinations from a Greek bishop, it could be argued that they were actually saying that the church didn't exist in Russia, not that the church didn't exist.
Well, no. See, the problem is that they didn't claim that. They actually chrismated Metropolitan Ambrose.
I remember.
Yeah, and they were like, "Oh, you got to renounce your heresy and schism," and and they had some, like an Old Believer priest like anoint him with chrism, saying, "Now you receive back everything you lost, what you never had." I guess
it's just.
So I mean, they were essentially claiming. Well, the point is that's kind of like I'm saying at best the Old Believers were extremely inconsistent and didn't think things out. At worst, they had a heretical ecclesiology without even necessarily thinking.
Which led into other heretical ecclesiology.
Exactly. Because remember, a lot of the priestless Old Believers actually were more logically consistent in carrying through the system. That's my point. Right. Like saying, well, if they don't have bishops and we can't have priests, et cetera, you know? And they remember they couldn't even consecrate chrism until they got new bishops back in the 1840s.
Yeah.
Because they had to keep on recycling this old chrism and like adding, like they would try to add oil of the catechumens to it that they would make and things like that. So it caused all these, you know, weird problems. So again, like people have romanticized the Old Believers, but you know, without realizing that, you know, they had a lot of their own issues, and it wasn't. I mean, the other thing is this: the Old Believers claim that you know, they were standing up against oppression. Okay, that's partially true, but people forget the Old Believers promoted the Stogloff Synod, which was back like 1557, and it was a Stogloff Synod. There was like people talking about how they should execute heretics and they should execute non-Orthodox.
Yeah.
All right. So, I mean, they didn't necessarily do that a whole lot. I think they did. There were one or two people like Judaizing heretics that were kind of like were combining Judaism with Orthodoxy that were executed in this period or something like that. But I mean, and the other point was that you look at the Old Believer, supposedly the golden period the Old Believers looked back to, which is like the 1500s. And, you know, the Stogloff Synod anathematized back in the 1557 or so, or 1556, those who make the sign of the cross with 3 fingers. All right. But they technically are still in communion with the other Orthodox churches that make the sign of the cross with 3 fingers.
Right. Yeah.
And what happened on Mount Athos was that, like, the Russian monks from Mount Athos were like, we can't accept this anathema because we, you know, how are we supposed to, you know, can celebrate with the Greeks who are our brothers and the Bulgarians, et cetera, when they do this, you know? So, I mean, and even when the ecumenical patriarch Jeremiah the Illustrious came to Moscow, and you know, this kind of gets into kind of current events. But when he established he officially kind of recognized Moscow as a patriarchate, you know, he was able, you know, to celebrate a liturgy and everything. And the Russians made the sign of the cross with 2 fingers. He did with 3 fingers, and he did his stuff and they did their stuff. But if you know, this was apparently so evil, why didn't they break communion with him then? You know, or when the Patriarch of Jerusalem visited Patriarch Job in 1620, you know. So my point is that a lot of the things the Old Believers bring up, you know, I don't really take seriously. And to me, it seems like there was other stuff going on that made them do what they do.
Oh, and there were economic reasons as well as other things. So, you know, I agree with you. There were other external things, but ultimately a lot of them were in heresy, I think, is basically.
Yes, I think, yeah, heresy. I think that's the fact that they had a heretical ecclesiology was the big thing.
So now we get to the next question. We have Justice for Orthodoxy. How do the Orthodox interpret the writings of Saint Irenaeus on the Pope of Rome?
Okay, so what specific writing? I think you're talking about Saint Irenaeus of Lyon.
Yeah, most likely.
Okay, so I think, what is he referencing? Something in Against Heresy, where he's talking about the center of all. Hold on.
My guess is the first principality, or, you know, either that or he's talking about the list. If he's talking about the apostolic list, Saint Irenaeus was giving an example. If he's talking about propter principitatum, there's different ways to interpret that. But what you'll find is that translations of Saint Irenaeus will usually use the most flowery language towards Rome, when it could simply mean that Rome was the most important city. In either case, it's not, I guess.
Well, the other thing is that when people hear the word princeps and they translate it as prince, that sounds like very monarchical and absolutist. The word princeps originally just meant first.
Yeah. I
mean, I think it actually is let me look up. I think it's actually a contraction of like first citizen or something like that. You look on Wikipedia, but the point is that, for example, like you have Saint Peter is called Prince of the Apostles, and or in like some Latin text, or even an equivalent in a Greek text. That just means he's first among the apostles.
Yeah, but
it doesn't mean he's Lord and Master.
Right, but Saint Irenaeus isn't even referencing Saint Peter. He's simply
Princeps literally means first or foremost or distinguished.
So yeah, I would say that unless, assuming it's not one of those texts there, Justice, you'd have to give me the text involved. But if it's basically about the city of Rome, or if it is about, you know, the apostolic list, those things do not have to be interpreted and should not be interpreted in some sort of ultramontane manner, because usually his meaning was much more innocent than that. So if you want to get a text, that's fine. We'll look at it, but most likely, my guess is it's going to fall into one of the 2 things we just described. Okay.
Next question.
Next question, Matthew Thompson. Is it canonical for the Patriarch of Constantinople to grant autocephaly to Ukraine?
Haven't we? Well, I'm going to answer this question in the abstract, and I'd say no in the abstract.
Okay.
I'm not with any of these jurisdictions, but I'm just going to say technically no in the abstract, because if it just in addressing the question in an abstract sense, if one recognizes Ukraine as being part of another autocephalous church, you're essentially dividing up an autocephalous church by one other autocephalous church.
Right. So effectively, you know, again, now the question, of course, and I'm playing I don't want to say devil's advocate, because that's, you know, the wrong word, but the point is, those arguing for autocephaly were saying that somehow Moscow never really had the jurisdiction over Ukraine.
That goes back to what, the 1686 decision to allow the Patriarch of Moscow to consecrate the metropolitan. I need to read this decision. I think I may have read it years ago.
Yeah, and I think
but I think there have been, they make a good point about that. I think there's some actually points there, but I think other people have pointed out this, that when the transfer of the Kievan metropolis was made to the Patriarch of Moscow back in the 1680s, the Kievan metropolis didn't include a large portions of central and eastern Ukraine. All right, those were already under the Patriarch of Moscow. All right, back in the 1680s. So the modern argument that, you know, this would apply to all of the Ukrainian territories, you know, technically, if you're going to go by the you know, the 1686 decision or whatever, it would basically be what, parts of central and western Ukraine.
Right, it would be much smaller than it is now.
Exactly. So everybody's kind of playing fast and loose with some of the facts, I think.
Yeah.
You know?
No, absolutely. And I think, and ultimately, that's the sort of thing that does require a pan-Orthodox synod to resolve. And so, if that's not resolved that way, it's gonna become an even worse version of the OCA situation, where basically, like, you know, half of world Orthodoxy recognizes them as autocephalous, and the other half doesn't. And but even worse than that, the involvement of the Ukrainian unions makes this 10 times worse.
And then the Moscow Patriarchate going to the Pope and asking him for advice.
That's something that a lot of people don't even know about.
Exactly. It's absolutely ridiculous. I mean,
you can talk a little about that because people don't actually realize.
Yeah, Hilarion Alfeyev, who's the Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev, who is the effectively second in command of the Moscow Patriarchate, for lack of a better word. He's head of the Department of External Church Affairs. The kind of their press guy and their spokesman for their synod right under the Patriarch Kirill of the Moscow Patriarchate. You know, he's basically been visiting Pope Francis and saying, well, you know, we've been informing the Pope about what's going on, and maybe we can ask his advice. And, you know,
why does he need to know?
And then he's speaking at a Roman Catholic Synod of Bishops that was being held in Rome. So, I mean, anybody who thinks, I mean, I unfortunately, if you think that this is just simply some kind of divide between ecumenist Constantinople and anti-ecumenist Moscow, I think there's much. It's not so simple than that, you know. So,
well, but
unfortunately, it's not that.
Well, I know, but what it does point to is that there's a division within the Russian intelligentsia, because we just saw recently a Moscow priest talking about reuniting with the old calendarists and anathematizing Bartholomew. Clearly,
you see, but those are here. The problem is that those are Ukrainian. That was the archpriest in Odessa. And I think my theory is, strangely enough, is that you probably at these diocesan levels, for example, remember Bishop Longinus, the one who's the big non-commemorator that was like condemning Patriarch Kirill for some time, and he was condemning ecumenism. He was Ukrainian. He was from southern Ukraine, Moscow. People talk about Ukrainians as kind of they're causing all these problems and such, but some of these like most conservative anti-ecumenist type Moscow Patriarchate bishops are actually Ukrainians, or they're half Ukrainian, half Romanian. Like, for example, that was Bishop Longin. He was like half. He speaks Ukrainian. He's like Ukrainian, but he also has Romanian heritage and such. So, I mean, people need to kind of cool about just attacking Ukraine as like fake people, just because, you know, Ukrainian units and Ukrainian nationalists do stupid stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
you know? It's like saying Swedes aren't a real people because the Danish used to rule everybody. You know.
Yeah.
I mean, the Danes and the Swedes and the Norwegians and the Icelanders are probably like one Norse people, in the same sense that you can say the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, and the Carpatho-Russians are like one East Slavic people of Rus, you might say. You know, but that doesn't mean they're not differences between those types of people.
No, absolutely.
So I mean, but my point is that I can't remember. Our father Novikov, Andrei Novikov, was the one who like said, "Well, this is what we're going to do, and we need to do this," about talking to the old calendarists. But he's not technically and I don't think in any major position in the.
But he was in Ukraine until he was chased out.
Well, in Ukraine he was, because technically the Ukrainian Moscow Patriarchate Church was technically an autonomous church.
Yeah.
I mean, they were part of it, but they were like, it's like all they had technically. I think an autonomous church meant they had to have their metropolitan confirmed by like the Moscow Patriarchate.
Right. Yeah. It's
so they could theoretically.
Using past tense for
I think theoretically they were allowed to elect and consecrate bishops without the approval of the Patriarch. It was just their primate. They needed because technically within the Ukrainian Moscow Patriarchate Autonomous Church, they had multiple metropolitans. I think they had like 3 or 4 metropolitans, but the Metropolitan of Kiev was like the primate metropolitan, you might say.
Right.
All right. So, I mean, I'm not endorsing everything. I don't. I'm a true Orthodox old calendars person myself, so I'm not obviously endorsing everything there. I'm just saying that it's a lot more complicated than simply, supposedly anti-ecumenist Moscow and ecumenist Constantinople, because Moscow has been doing all kinds of stupid, heretical and stupid ecumenical stuff. And I originally had a feeling that maybe this could get out of control and turn against, some of those types of people, but I don't know. So
it's still all up in the air.
I mean, that would, but they did mention, you're right, they did mention talking to like the Greek old calendarist, and then one of the Greek old calendar synods, the largest of them supposedly, said, well, we will be willing to talk in making some kind of abstract statement. So there was probably stuff going behind the scenes about,
there probably still is. I mean, I hate to say this, but a lot of the stuff that is put out, even by official media, is done for specific consumption.
Yeah, and remember, Metropolitan Anthony of Briansk or something like that, and like a week before this happened, said, how would the Greeks feel if we went into Greece and started talking and solving the problem of the old calendars? And they said, no, we won't do that. But how would they feel? And then, like a few days later, Father Andrei Novikov comes out with his plan, and then this one large Greek old calendar synod comes out with a statement. So,
all this
to me, I was like putting things together. Something's happening here,
Something's that's my point. There's phone calls, and my guess is.
But I don't think it's going to go anywhere if you're going to have Hilarion Alfeyev and Patriarch Kirill saying how they're going to be talking to the Pope. That's just going to be a non-starter.
Well, again, now the question is that being done for consumption of certain groups as well? Again, it's tricky because we're trying to figure out who they're really reaching out to and who they're speaking to. And I think we'll still see a lot more interesting stuff happening in the coming weeks. And we'll report on it. We'll talk about it. That's not a problem. But I think in terms of answering the question that Matthew had, I think basically it's an iffy granting of autocephaly, and it would require ratification from the rest of world orthodoxy.
The problem is that the principle is this, and it doesn't matter whether you're Orthodox or calendars or world Orthodox. The principle is this: does the ecumenical patriarch have the authority to carve up another church?
Ultimately, that's what it comes down to.
I think that's what it comes down to. That's, in my opinion, that's ultimately what it is.
My bigger fear is that the motivation behind that claimed power is, in effect, very close to papalism, which is what a lot of people in the MP are doing.
And remember, it was this Father Andrei Novikov that came up with this proposed union with the old calendars. That was the one that wrote the article, "The Heresy of Eastern Papism." They posted on pravoslavy.ru.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so so let's move into the next question. We've done the whole Ukraine, Constantinople, Moscow patriarch stuff to death for like the past 2 shows, it seems.
Well, they can't resolve it, so it seems like it's never going to stop.
Exactly. But the next question is from Veris. I don't know. It's not a question, but kind of a.
Yeah, it's my points of contention are the filioque, papal supremacy, the essence energy distinction, divorce in the Orthodox Church, and just general books to read on those topics. Okay, so that's basically like.
And then he says, I find myself going to the fathers of scriptures, but it just gets deep, and I need a quick answer to help me convert. Then I can get more deep.
You see, I was the second part of that, and here's the problem with this, Verum. Orthodox apologetics doesn't work that way. We don't go for gotcha sound bites. It's not, you have to go to the fathers. You have to understand their mindset. If you want very simple and quick answers, I can give them to you in a few minutes, in like literally a minute, if I may, Father.
Okay.
But unfortunately, the quick answers are themselves not going to be satisfying. But with that said, here we go. The filioque was actually introduced in the late 8th to 9th century, contrary to what history books teach about it, which is that it was put in the Synod of Toledo in 589. Father Enoch's research on that shows that it was an interpolation. It was put much later, and it was forced in by the Hildebrandians. Papal supremacy was introduced with the Dictatus Papae in 1075 with Hildebrand, and therefore did not exist previously. None of the claims could be read. The fathers, even the papal fathers before the schism, cannot be interpreted in a Roman Catholic sense without the backing of the Dictatus Papae. In short, it is an 11th century teaching that basically is anachronistic and reading the fathers backwards. The essence energies distinction we've covered many times. Very simply, God is both unapproachable and he reaches out to us. Those two things are both true in the scriptures and in the fathers. If you say that they're not, then if you say effectively that you can't distinguish between God's essence, which is unapproachable, with God's energies, which reach out to us, then unfortunately you have the problem of the Eucharist. You can't consume God if God cannot actually interact with you. It's that simple. Divorce in the Orthodox Church, divorce was allowed in the West. It was not approved of in either the West or the East, but it was allowed, and there's histories with bigamists and trigamists in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and continued centuries. And just general books to read on those topics, I would start with Overbeck. Okay, I'm done. You have anything to add, Father?
Abbe Guité, The Papacy, would be also a
great,
book.
Fantastic book to read. I agree completely.
Yes.
A lot of, I would say Overbeck's, Apologetic was one of the best. Mm-hmm. I'd say also the Catechism. So I'm amazed at how many Orthodox converts exist and don't read the Catechism. Or
yes, the Catechism of the Holy Orthodox Catholic Eastern Church.
Yep.
Which was sometimes called the Catechism of Peter McGill, although it's actually heavily edited. It wasn't. People forget. It was technically the only catechism that produced an orthodoxy to achieve near universal, if not universal, approval. It was translated into English by an American Orthodox convert.
First known American Orthodox.
Yes, exactly. First known American Orthodox convert, Colonel Ludwell III. And then it was republished, and with the spelling, with the orthography made more modern, so you could distinguish between F's and S's, by Dr. Overbeck. In the 1880s, I believe. And it is a superb catechism. People say they found better, but I think it's a great catechism.
The only other catechism...
And there's the larger catechism, Russian Catechism, and Metropolitan St. Philaret. But to me, it's a little bit shorter, but I still think it's a very good catechism.
Well, the point is, either one of those, I'm shocked at how many people come into Orthodoxy and have not seen either one.
Well, here's the problem. People try to say don't read them because they're scholastic, and that is the absolute worst thing to say. The result is they give people some book by some guy in 1995 or 2000.
One of the new elders. Exactly.
And oftentimes they're not even clergy, or there may be clergy. It doesn't really matter. Instead of going back to this, what people forget is you have to have the solid basics. If you don't have the solid basics down, even if you've read dozens of books and you think you know all about Orthodoxy, going back and reading the catechism, that's not going to hurt you. It's just going to reconfirm things in your mind.
Yeah.
If you look at the great catechism, that great catechism that was published by all the Orthodox Church and approved in the 17th century, and I can that it's heavily scriptural based. They have a lot of quotations from the fathers. They have a lot of questions. It builds and it builds and it builds, and it was praised by the patriarchs of Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, Romania, the Romanian Church, the Russian bishops. Effectively, it wasn't replaced in Russia until the larger Catechism of Metropolitan Philaret, which was in many ways kind of like I think a different version of it. His version of it, I think, was not as big. I believe the Philaretian Catechism.
Yeah.
But again, I think that's the point. People just read the Catechism.
It's a great start. It often references fathers you can read and go more deeply into, whether it be St. John of Damascus or St. Augustine, etc. So just keep trying.
Okay, so the next question is by Atomic Lead, who says, "How would you respond to E. Michael Jones?" Who I'm not sure who. I'm not quite sure.
Who is he?
I'm not. I have a vague idea, but I'm not quite sure. He's arguing that Christianity is incompatible with just one country, and Orthodox churches inevitably become neutered. I think E. Michael Jones is a Roman Catholic writer, a traditionalist Roman Catholic
writer.
I'm reading
he is on Wikipedia.
He's a traditionalist Roman Catholic?
He's a writer, professor, media commentator, current editor of Culture Wars magazine. Jones is known for his writings from a perspective which defends the Catholic Church and the decline of faith.
Okay, so his argument is that Christianity is incompatible with just one country, and Orthodox churches inevitably become neutered state churches like Anglicanism. Well, I don't think that's true at all. In fact, I think you can argue the same thing about papism. For example, the Spanish monarchy essentially controlled for a long time, or had a lot of influence in the Spanish Roman Catholic Church. The same thing for the French. The same thing for the Poles, the King of Poland.
Yeah, I don't.
And the popes were very careful about trying to fight those things.
I think if you want to get to the real core of it, again, this is kind of a stealth argument for the papacy. And what that means, what I mean by that is that basically the argument is, well, no matter how corrupt or how poor spiritually a country becomes, at least in Rome the faith is kept undefiled. So no matter what country you find in a Catholic, Roman Catholic communion, well, you always have Rome. But the truth of the matter is that if you take Rome out of the equation, then Roman Catholic countries are just as messed up as Orthodox ones in the modern era.
I think they're far more messed up.
It's in some cases, in some cases they're not, but ultimately it's the faith of the people. Certainly it's not the Pope that's helping, especially not this one. So the idea that there's because the Pope makes some sort of perfect union, it's this imaginary idea that he's this magic guardianship of unity that, professes the perfect faith, which he does not. And
I think we should make a point that no matter how influential and how overbearing an emperor or king may have been in an Orthodox country, there is always a point in which Orthodox bishops would say, we're not going to do this. For example, the emperor would try to impose iconoclasm. He succeeded to some extent, but there was massive resistance to iconoclasm. All right, and in the end, who won? Orthodoxy won.
Right.
It took back over the state.
I'd love to place that in a context with Rome. Very recently, the Pope approved 4 of the bishops of the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association as real bishops. Now, keep in mind that in China, there was something that used to be called the Cardinal Kung Foundation, which was one of the foundations of what they referred to as the underground church. These were people who had no communion with the State Patriotic Association. And when Francis did this, something that no Pope previously had done, effectively, the underground churches were disgusted. They were amazed that, supposedly, Rome, which obviously had no stake, like China wasn't going to go kill them or anything, kill the Pope or anything. So obviously there was no motivation for them to basically abandon, and that's how many of their people and their bishops spoke, that the Pope literally abandoned them for the sake of filthy lucre, for the sake of getting recognition from the country of China or the communist government of China. That's sad and unfortunate. It's really a shame. So,
right.
I think
what's the next question?
I hope that helps, atomically. The next question is: your Orthodox Metropolitan communion with Metropolitan Onufrius of Bergamo? I think so. Yeah.
I think we still are. We don't really hear a lot from him.
But yeah,
I see him on Facebook. He's like going and visiting his hometown in Romania, but that's all I really ever see.
Yeah, I think
he's kind of sick. I think his health is declining. But
so that's it. But he didn't do much. He was when Milan basically wanted to join with the MP, he sided with us. I see nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
So I hope he's okay, and I hope prayers for his good health.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question, Justice. Hopes that helps. And anyway, if any more questions, please feel free. We are here till 10 o'clock Eastern time. So.
All right. So, what other subjects? What do we think about the whole Halloween stuff, Father? We're about this. Halloween's tomorrow, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, yeah. That's now. It's wow. We could talk a lot about the Halloween stuff. First off, allow me to plug for the holiday that I've been pushing for the past 5 to 7 years. Now I can't remember because I can't remember when I started it on Twitter. But November 2nd is officially Have Some Candy Day. I refer to Have Some Candy Day as a day where you can get all the candy you want without having to go trick-or-treating, just by going to your local store and finding it at a discount of 30 to 70%. You'll be able to have as much candy as you want, and you won't even have to beg someone or wear a silly costume. Have Some Candy Day this November 2nd.
Oh, here's another question from Verames Munum. Does the Orthodox Church have any views similar to that of transubstantiation? We believe in transubstantiation, essentially, yes.
One thing,
St. Raphael Hawawini, who in the early 20th century said that the Orthodox Church believes in transubstantiation and accepts it, even if we don't accept all of scholastic philosophy. So, in fact, the term transubstantiation, the equivalent Greek or the Slavonic term for it, is used, in fact, in the Catechism of the Orthodox Catholic Church, published in the mid-1600s.
Right. I think that one of the things you have to realize is that what the Orthodox don't like about the terminology. I don't mean the term, I mean the terminology, is they don't like this idea that they don't like the whole, like, okay, it's the body, blood, soul, and divinity, and all this other stuff that popped up later in the Eucharist.
Or remember, interrupt, but remember that Synod of Jerusalem we do believe that when the transformation happens, we have the entire Christ is present.
Yeah, of course.
It's not just his body and blood divorced of his divinity. We don't believe in a story. I mean, that's the Coptic view for technically. People forget.
Coptics really do believe that the divinity.
Well, remember, yeah. See, this is the whole thing. This is kind of getting wider, far afield. But there was this big debate in the Coptic Church in the 20th century between Pope Shenouda and there was like this Father Matthew the Poor, and like Matthew the Poor was like saying, I know this is not orthodoxy, but this is just giving an example. Was trying to say that it's the divinity is there too. And Shenouda was like, no, that you don't receive the divinity. You just receive the body and blood because you can't. Because remember, Shenouda didn't believe in essence energy distinction. Because technically the Copt. Now, there's a big thing about that. That may be a result of the Monophysite, the Monophysite influence. But then the other point is that the Coptic Church, as people have pointed out, has been heavily Protestant influenced since basically the mid 19th century by Anglicanism.
Yeah, no. The Orthodox belief is that it's interesting because. What Verum wrote afterwards, I thought the Orthodox had a position, yes, it's the body and blood of Jesus, the rest is a mystery. Well, no, the body and blood of Jesus, this is the mystery. I mean, the ultimate reality that you can get to is that you're ingesting God. That's a huge thing. And of course we believe that. And anyone who says we believe less than that isn't being honest about our position, or they don't know it.
In fact, continue, Father, continue.
Well, I was simply going to point out that basically, what we're not a fan of is we're not a fan of all the additional terminology. We're not a fan of the logical definition of it. While we do believe to some degree in ecclesia supplet, it's not simply a matter of saying the right words and things like that. It's not a magic formula. If you know the Protestants, the term hocus pocus was originally a mockery of the term hocus corpus, which means this is the body. The point is...
Now, Decree 17 of the Synod of Jerusalem in 1672. Remember, the Synod of Jerusalem is a pan-Orthodox synod, and this synod was approved by all the Orthodox churches. Okay? Decree 17 states, and this is binding as far as I'm concerned, that the Orthodox believe the all-holy mystery of the sacred Eucharist, which we have enumerated above, fourth in order, to be that which our Lord delivered in the night in which he gave himself up for the life of the world. For taking bread and blessing, he gave it to his holy disciples and apostles, saying, Take, eat, this is my body. And taking the chalice and giving thanks, he said, Drink you all of it, this is my blood, which for you is being poured out for the remission of sins. In the celebration of this, we believe the Lord Jesus Christ to be present. He is not present typically, nor figuratively, nor by superabundant grace, as in the other mysteries, nor by a bare presence, as some of the fathers have said concerning baptism, or by impanation, so that the divinity of the Word is united to the set forth bread of the Eucharist hypostatically, as the followers of Luther most ignorantly and wretchedly supposed. But he is present truly and really, so that after the consecration of the bread and wine, the bread is transmuted, transubstantiated, converted, and transformed into the true body itself, the Lord, which was born in Bethlehem of the ever Virgin, was baptized in the Jordan, suffered, was buried, rose again, was received up, sits at the right hand of God the Father, and is to come again in the clouds of heaven. And the wine is converted and transubstantiated, or metausiast, I guess, in the Greek, into the true blood itself of the Lord, which as he hung upon the cross was poured out for the life of the world. Further, we believe that after the consecration of the bread and the wine, there no longer remains the substance of the bread and of the wine, but the body itself and the blood of the Lord under the species or forms, I'm not sure what the Greek word for species is, in form of bread and wine, that is to say, under the accidents of the bread. Further, that the all pure body itself and the blood of the Lord is imparted and enters into the mouth and stomachs of the communicants, whether pious or impious. Nevertheless, they convey to the pious and worthy remission of sins and life eternal, but to the impious and unworthy involve condemnation and eternal punishment. Further, that the body and blood of the Lord are severed and divided by the hands and teeth, though in accidents only, that is, in the accidents, the bread and the wine, under which they are visible and tangible, we do acknowledge, but in themselves to remain entirely unsevered and undivided. Wherefore the Catholic Church also says, Broken and distributed is he that is broken, yet not severed. who has ever eaten yet never consumed, but sanctifying those that partake, that is, worthily. Further, that in every part or the smallest division of the transmuted bread and wine, there is not a part of the body and blood of the Lord. For to say so were blasphemous and wicked, but the entire whole Lord Christ substantially, that is, with his soul and divinity, or perfect God and perfect man. So that though there may be many celebrations in the world at one and the same hour, there are not many Christs or bodies of Christ, but it is one and the same Christ that is truly and really present, and his one body and his blood in all the several churches of the faithful. And this not because the body of the Lord that is in the heavens descends upon the altars, but because the bread of the prosthesis set forth in all the several churches, being changed and transubstantiated, becomes and is, after consecration, one and the same with that in the heavens. For it is one body of the Lord in many places, and not many. And therefore this mystery is the greatest, and is spoken of as wonderful, and comprehensible by faith only, and not by the sophistries of man's wisdom, whose vain and foolish curiosity in divine things our pious and God-delivered religion rejects. Further, the body itself of the Lord and the blood that are in the mystery of the Eucharist ought to be honored in the highest manner and adored with latria, for one is the adoration of the Holy Trinity and of the body and blood of the Lord. Further, that it is a true and propitiatory sacrifice offered for all Orthodox living and dead, and for the benefit of all, as is set forth expressly in the prayers of the mystery delivered to the church by the apostles, in accordance with the command they received of the Lord. Further, that before its use, immediately after the consecration, and after its use, what is reserved in the sacred pyxes for the communion of those that are about to depart is the true body of the Lord, and on the least different from it, so that before its use and after the consecration, in its use, after its use, it is in all respects the true body of the Lord. Further, we believe that by the word transubstantiation, the manner is not explained, by which the bread and wine are changed into the body and blood of the Lord. For that is altogether incomprehensible and impossible, except by God himself, and those who imagine to do so are involved in ignorance and impiety. For that the bread and wine are after the consecration, not typically, nor figuratively, nor by superabundant grace, nor by the communication or the presence of the divinity alone of the only begotten, transmuted into the body and blood of the Lord. Neither is any accident of the bread or of the wine by any conversion or alteration changed into an accident of the body and blood of Christ. But truly and really and substantially doth the bread become the true body itself of the Lord, and the wine the blood itself of the Lord, as is said above. And lastly, further, that this mystery of the sacred Eucharist can be performed by none other, except only by an Orthodox priest, who has received his priesthood from an Orthodox and canonical bishop, in accordance with the teaching of the Eastern Church. This is compendiously the doctrine and true confession, the most ancient tradition of the Catholic Church concerning this mystery, which must not be departed from in any way by such as would be orthodox, and who reject the novelties and profane vanities of heretics. But necessarily, the tradition of the institution must be kept whole and unimpaired. For those that transgress, the Catholic Church of Christ rejects and anathematizes. That's the.
I think that, I think that basically. So I think to answer the question, yeah, it's definitely the body and blood of Christ.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay. Another question is Symphonia. Matthew Thompson.
Wait, we get in order, Father. We missed one.
Okay. What are we?
How much of the horror stories about Hockna and Pantaleimon are true? Okay. Well, first off, as somebody who was baptized in Hockna, as somebody who did remember the monastery, the first thing I would like to point out is that Father Pantaleimon is dead. First off, he did die about 4 years ago. All I can say is pray for his soul. As I understand it, the reason that most of the monastery's population left, and then ultimately they tried to go to the Synod of Archbishop Kalinikos, but they weren't able to put a monastery together. Things kept going wrong. Things kept falling apart. Someone like Bishop Demetrius in the U.S. is a great bishop. He actually comes from Hockna. I knew him when he was a monk there. And the point is, are these stories true? Well, what precipitated the departure was a Synodia meeting where allegedly Father Pantaleimon admitted to everything. And so ultimately, I would think that the fact that virtually almost everybody in the monastery, except for a few like Father Basil, who simply refused to leave because his room was there, I think that says everything that needs to be said about it. Since then, Hockna has kind of become a small Imyaslavist sect.
Well, they're trying to back away from Imyaslavy now.
Well, thankfully, but the point is they're a lot smaller than they used to be. The monastery was shrunk down to a skeleton of what it was. The whole thing is tragic. When I stayed there, I did not see anything wrong, but I have spoken to a number of former monastics who they did testify to abuse. I think it's horrible. I think it's a terrible abuse of authority. I think that, to some degree, Father Panteleimon was a little bit shisty. And what I mean by that is when I met him, he sounded like he was an off the boat immigrant. And it turned out that he was born in Detroit. And, there was a lot of persona that was projected, which is unfortunately a hallmark of a cult leader. I'm not saying that that's what he was. And I am not one way or another. I think you'd have to speak to somebody who was actually involved, who was a monastic there, etc., and listen to them and give their words to some degree of fair hearing. But in the end, whether he was guilty or not, and I mean, I'm of the school that he probably was guilty. The only thing you can do at this point is pray for him, because he's
okay.
Next, now your Symphonia question. Hopes that helps.
Okay, so Matthew Thompson asks, is Symphonia the only orthodox political theory, and how would it work in modern political systems where there is no monarch? Well, it is the preferred orthodox political theory. It's the one we want to happen. But if there is no monarch, for Symphonia to work, technically the state has to acknowledge the Orthodox Church as the true church. That's the primary thing. So theoretically, you could probably have maybe a system of some sort of republic that acknowledges, technically Greece recognizes the Orthodox Church as the true church, but that isn't really, Greece is still kind of secular, I guess, right, Father?
Yeah, it is a secular country at this point.
They got rid of the king, and there was the whole Venizelos, the liberal prime minister back in the 1920s, and things like that, who kind of began there's a whole lot of history behind that, but how would it work in a modern political system where there's no monarch? I don't think it could really work very well in a non-monarchical system.
Well, it depends. If you hold to the theory, for example, that countries by nature will fall apart. There's talks about the secession of California, etc. I mean, any of them could be ruled by a strongman who happens to be Orthodox, and you could have a dwarf.
Yeah. If you had a constitutional like a president for life guy who's like, I believe in orthodoxy.
Yeah.
That could work because if people forget, originally the Roman emperor was interpreted for a very, very long time as not a king in the sense of like the later medieval, Renaissance, royalty type thing. The emperor was perceived as a constitutional supreme dictator. In fact, if you look at the laws of Justinian and Justinian has this political theory in his law, in his institutes, I believe. He says that the emperor derives his power from something called the lex. I can't remember what I wrote a post about this one time, where he derives his power from the conferring of the Senate and people of Rome, and they give him absolute power under the kind of constitutional provisions. All right, because this goes back to Augustus. Augustus, I'm taking emergency powers to restore the republic and such like that, but they kind of never gave him up. Yeah. So you could theoretically have a strong man who becomes president for life, and then his son becomes president for life. And then eventually, in the Byzantine Empire, by the time you get to the 12th century, you get the Paleologan dynasty, which kind of transitions to dynastic rule as a normative thing in Byzantium and such. But all I'd say, and unless you disagree with me, Father, is that you have to have some sort of monarchical rule of some sort, even if it's not some guy calling himself the king, for a Symphonia to work in the probably the well-envisioned way it's worked historically, right?
No, I would agree. I'd agree. And I think that, it can work on a small scale. I don't see any rise of an empire. I mean, there's talk about the prophecies of the Tsar returning, but even then Russia will be smaller. So I don't see it. We're still going to be kind of in, for lack of a better word, persecuted mode. And I don't mean that we're being actively persecuted, but we're not in a situation where Symphonia could be a normative thing anywhere in the world, even though that can always change.
So Brian Johnson asks, I saw one survey indicate the Orthodox Christians make up only 12% of the world's population. Why so small? It seems the church is failing. Why is the heterodox so much bigger? Well, I think 12% is a gross overestimation.
Yeah,
because technically that'd be 600 million, 700 million, about 800 million people or something like that. There's not that many. There were 7 billion people on the planet, right?
Yeah, here's the thing, Father, and I saw this question and I was fascinated. The first thing I did, if you go to Wikipedia, this is fun. You can like look up a list of countries by population, and I went to 1700. Now, in 1700, more than 50% of the world's population was under the Qing dynasty in China or the Mughal Empire in India.
How much? What percentage of the population?
More than 50%.
Okay.
The total world population at that time was 682 million people. So now, if we go even further, we include Japan, we include the Ottoman Empire, Tokugawa shogunate. Basically, the Russian Empire was perhaps percentage of world population. It's right here. Let's see. The Russian Empire, Stardom of Russia was 2.1% of the population. Assuming assuming that basically, you have Orthodox Christians throughout, certain parts of the Ottoman Empire, which was only 3.6% of the population. Let's assume half of it just for the fun of it. In 1700, we weren't doing a great job either. The point is, we haven't been doing a great job historically since the beginning, because if you go to the beginning, ultimately, even the areas that we reached, we were barely touching Asia, and Asia has always been more popular than us. We didn't touch any of the Americas, so none of those native peoples, throw them out. And then, by the 6th century, you had Islam fighting in Africa. 7th century, excuse me. So the point is,
I mean, Orthodoxy did reach down into Sudan and Nubia.
Yeah, it did.
That was the furthest south we kind of got, except for Ethiopia, which kind of became monophysite eventually, though.
Right. But the point I'm trying to make is that ultimately, the church has never been about converting the entire world. We have a mission to the entire world, but that mission does not guarantee success. And it historically never has. So the church will always be a little flock. It always has been a little flock. Even if we take out the discussions between official Orthodoxy, true Orthodoxy, so on and so forth, we're still not that big. Historically, we've never been that big.
I think people have the idea that you look up at least the first millennium, that most of European society, and large portions of the Middle Eastern society, were Orthodox Christian. All right. So it seems for the last 1,000 years, Orthodoxy has essentially been kind of partially in defensive mode. I guess, we were kind of in defensive mode with the rise of Islam, but it seems like Orthodoxy has been experiencing a lot of problems in the last 700 years.
Well, yeah, but the point is, if you look at, if that's the beauty of this Wikipedia thing, you can just go backwards in time. So if you look at the population of the world in the year 1000, it was roughly 310 million. Again, you find the Song dynasty up there with 24.19% of the population. The Byzantine Empire, which was at that point still a very large area, was 12,000 people. It was 12 million people, or 3.87% of the population. Japan, 2.26% of the population. Kiev and Rus was 1.74% of the population. And the Holy Roman Empire, which was still part of the church then, was 1.82% of the population. So, ultimately, when you get to that point, if you're looking at populated Earth, we still weren't that big in the year 1000.
We covered a large, Europe and a few other areas, but there weren't a lot of people living in those areas. If you think about it.
Yeah. And
it was really sparsely populated.
Yeah. So the point is, it's the idea of Brian's point. Well, we're going to get to that, and we'll touch to that on that. I hope that answers the first part of this question, Brian, and we'll get back to your next comment as we continue.
Okay. All right. So the next question from Verum, I guess, is: are there time limits for how long one can be a catechumen? I figured that if I could have a relatively long period of time as a catechumen, I could perhaps get into a deep study.
Okay. Well, you're the priest, so I'm going to let you lead on this.
I think sometimes I'm trying to remember. Some of the canons say 2-3 years sometimes for a catechumen.
That's very common.
Yes, but St. Chrysostom made the point that if a man came to him, I remember reading some other fathers, and he was begging for baptism, and he would baptize him almost immediately. But the problem is that most of the people who were catechumens were more like what we consider studiers or hearers or something like that. They weren't like, because for example, a lot of the rules were like, if you're going to be made an actual catechumen, you were like, there was like a process during Lent, like after the second or third Sunday in Lent, they would actually make you a catechumen. I mean, nowadays they kind of give all the service at once on Holy Saturday or whatever day you're baptized. But they actually, you went through the days of Lent and were given the catechumenate progressively. But a lot of times people were like attend sermons, and they would just be kind of professional catechumens for years and years, because some people didn't know what they wanted to do. They wanted to study. You know, you can do that if you want to, you know, but if you actually want to receive the catechumenate in the proper sense, that is to have prayers read over you, you are making still a commitment in that sense, that you're acknowledging that you're preparing to receive baptism. I think what he's kind of asking for is kind of, he wants to be like almost like what's called a hearer, I guess. What the ancient fathers would have called a hearer. That is somebody who kind of hears the teaching of the church and discusses it with people, but they don't really make a firm commitment at that point.
Well, I mean
you can do that if you want, but, you know.
I was a catechumen for 2 years. So, okay. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. I'm saying that really what it comes down to is, and when the priest who baptized me approved of it, he basically said, well, you know, if you're waiting for me to decide, I think you're ready right now. I think the question is, you have to make the effort. And when you do want to become a catechumen, you should have prayers read over you so that you're still considered in some way within the fold of the church.
Because you have to be given exorcisms to drive out evil spirits that might be trying to tempt you.
And then at that point, you should take it seriously. Now, here's what blows my mind. I've heard stories of people who took 2 years to convert and still don't know the basic catechism of the church. I think that what you need to take your time as a catechumen to really learn and really experience Orthodoxy, not just reading books, but also going to services, saying the prayers, so on and so forth. You need to try your best to live as an Orthodox Christian insofar as you can while you're a catechumen. And so the question as to whether there are time limits for how long, no. There are people who were catechumens for most of their lives, and I've known people who were catechumens for literally an hour. The question is not what the time limit is. The church doesn't set an official limit. It has recommended limits. But the question is how long it would take for you to be ready. And I think that's a question that if you're worried about your soul, that you should take seriously, and something you discuss with a priest.
Okay, so the next question by Atomic Lead is, why do the Orthodox not distinguish between mortal and venial sins? If a 13-year-old boy looks at pornography and dies before he repents and goes to confession, is he in hell for sure? Well, I would say if you read St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, he actually does make a distinction between what we would call deadly and minor sins.
Yeah.
And this is actually made in St. John Cassian in his conferences. The Desert Fathers made this, all right? So we do have a distinction in what are called deadly sins, or pardonable sins. By pardonable, they mean that technically if you die having committed them, you don't go to hell. All right. So I don't know where there's this problem that happened beginning of the late 19th and then really in the 20th century, where there was like the breaking free of the captivity of the Latin captivity or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And everything got thrown out. Not everything, but a lot of stuff got thrown out. And because if it sounded Roman Catholic, then it was just, oh, well, that's Roman Catholic. Get rid of that. Deadly sins, oh, we don't believe in that. All sin is the same. Well, yes, all sin in the sense that all sin is a transgression, missing the mark. Okay, that's true. But, it's like saying all crime is the same. I mean, somebody who kind of jaywalks, or somebody who steals a Snickers bar and someone who, murders somebody, that's, they're treated differently in the court system, So if a 13-year-old boy looks at porn and dies before he repents,
you're talking about a boy who's just, puberty has just been activated, and unfortunately, we live in the age of the internet, where unfortunately pornography is terribly accessible thanks to Google. Sorry, Google, but I know your host is.
Well, it depends on when does somebody become culpable. Kind of the age of reason. I don't know what, for lack of a better word.
The boy is culpable, but there's mitigating circumstances, like the fact that he's 13, the fact that he probably doesn't know any better, the fact that he might have looked it up on the advice of his friends, or because he was just being stupid. The point is, I'm not God, so I can't say the idea that he's in hell for sure. I'm not going to say that. Because was he a communing boy who was, trying to be the best person he could? And then
we have, like you said, we have no idea what happened the moments before he died.
universally judge someone like that.
I mean, there could be all kinds of people that we think were good Orthodox Christians, but it turns out in the Last Judgment you find out the truth.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate, but that's the reality. So I would say don't judge that way, and while he's alive, advise confession.
But the Orthodox do have a distinction, and I can maybe I don't. We should put it in the links. Saint Nicodemus talks about the distinction between what's called unpardonable sins, which he means by mortal sins. By unpardonable, he means that if you die, you aren't pardoned. By unpardonable sins, it means the deadly and venial sins. There is such a distinction in Orthodoxy historically, even if we don't have the complex kind of more so-called moral theology and casuistry that developed with the Jesuits, Alfonso Liguori, all this other stuff. We don't have a lot of that stuff.
That stuff the reason for that stuff also is tied to the indulgence system, which is something that Orthodoxy doesn't believe in either. Where certain of your venial sins or things that you go to purgatory for could be removed if you said this set of prayers or paid this much money.
But I think I should make a point that if somebody keeps on committing minor sins and they're like, oh, it's not a deadly sin, you're eventually going to go into the sin of pride by doing that and saying, I don't need to go to confession.
That's probably why we don't make that big of a distinction.
Because you don't want people thinking, well, I don't need to go to confession. I didn't do this. Exactly. I mean, I'm better than those other people. See, if you begin to say, I'm better than them, you're actually committing a deadly sin by doing that.
One of the worst sins, exactly.
Pride, the source of all sins. Okay, so the next question is, when did the ecumenical patriarchate start to install Greek patriarchs instead of the native Arabs? Well, it wasn't the ecumenical patriarch. If you read St. Raphael Hawawini's book called The Brotherhood of I think it was called The History of the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre, he talks a lot about this. And he's like no holds bar. And I think it was in the 1540s. And it wasn't the ecumenical patriarchate, I think, initially. Well, they may have been connected to it. There was something called the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre. Kind of took over the Patriarchate Jerusalem by I'd have to reread the book, but I think it had involved money. They kind of convinced the Arabs to say, well, if you elect a Greek monk as a patriarch, they can bring in more tourists. Use the word. They can take better care of the tourist sites, basically, and the churches. And the argument was that I think they may have actually bribed the Ottoman Pasha to help them out too, or something like that. But and this is a very hard pill to swallow. If you have to read Saint Raphael Hawawini on this.
Yeah,
and now Saint Raphael Hawawini doesn't condemn all the. He says, for example, Patriarch Dositheus was not that bad. He still was kind of pro-Greek, but he wasn't terrible to the Arabs. I mean, and there were holy patriarchs, like in the 1790s. There was one, I can't remember his name, who was considered a holy man.
Well, one of the reasons that this affected, especially like St. Raphael, etc., is because what happened with the Patriarchate of Antioch in the 1800s.
Well, the Brotherhood tried to take over the Brotherhood of Antioch in the 1800s too. People forget this. They failed. They almost took over Antioch. Yeah, but the reason that, they did kind of, in a sense, because remember that's the period where the Melkite Union. Oh, but that's in the 1720s and 30s. What happened? What you're referring to is basically they began to imply that Arabs can't really run an Orthodox church.
Exactly.
And that they have to have a Greek brotherhood run it, and Arabs can only be priests, and maybe an auxiliary bishop every now and again. And now there were cases like Saint Joseph of Damascus, the martyr. The martyr. He was able to rally back many of the Uniates back into Orthodoxy, and that's when discussions with the Russians began to try to see if they could make an independent patriarchate that was Arab again in Antioch. So there's a lot of history there that. Saint Raphael and they did succeed in that. Yeah. And the concept that because the the Arabs don't really understand Orthodoxy because the Antiochians later became this ecumenical whatever. Well, those are the Greek patriarchs. So I mean, this is really a lot of these discussions about the Arabs don't really know how to run a church, and they're really worse than the Greeks. I mean, it's all depending on whose perspective, So I mean. If you want, that's kind of a philatist, argument that everybody, even if you condemn it, people always kind of make their own philatist arguments that they claim is not really philatism. Yeah. But I should point out though, and you need to, and we can put Saint Raphael's the links to his book in the links, so we can do the links. We didn't do the links the past two shows, I don't think. But I know. Sorry. Hopefully, if you're right, I know, and I keep on forgetting. If you're on the Facebook group, then the links are all over. Exactly. Well, Saint Raphael brings up the point that. He says the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre in his time was worse than the Jesuits. That's what he says. That's very harsh, but that's what he believed. And there were terrible circumstances where the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre controlled all kinds of land in Georgia, Romania, Russia, etc. There was one case in which they had like a Matokian monastery in Romania, and the abbot ended up molesting all kinds of Romanian village children, and they were trying, and like it was this horrible catastrophe, and they couldn't really do anything to him because he was like, oh, I'm a Matokian, you can't depose me, you know. And so eventually the Romanian, like I think the Romanian prince said, leave or you're going to be put in prison, and they confiscated everything.
Yeah.
So, and the Brotherhood really never apologized for any of that. They were like, well, we didn't know, but they never, like, I don't even think they ever deposed this guy, you know? So, I mean, that doesn't mean there weren't holy people in the Brotherhood or whatever, but the problem is that when you have an organization that says only members of our Brotherhood can be the patriarch, which is technically not in the canons, that's like an extra things I gotta add, like almost like a bylaw stuff, you know? When you start doing stuff like that, and it's like you got to be an ethnic Greek or a certain proportion of Greek or whatever to be a member, or you can have one token Arab.
Yes.
That's going to breed corruption, unfortunately, over time.
I can agree completely.
And that's why you don't need. And there are such things as Orthodox Brotherhood, like fraternal societies, but that's not what the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre is.
No, it had a specific purpose. It still does.
Yes.
So, but in any case. Now Brian Johnson made the comment it was probably 12% of the Christian population. It could have been mistaken in my memory. I think your later comment that the historical comparisons are interesting. Yes, Orthodoxy has always been a small flock. We still have to reach out to the rest of the world, but we could with no expectation of material success.
Okay, so another question by Atomic Lead is Metropolitan Seraphim of Piraeus wrote a huge letter to Pope Francis, I remember, which mentions impersonal and juridical character of confession. Overbeck mentioned something similar. How do Orthodox view it? Now, I remember that if you look at Roman Catholic moral theology manuals from like I've actually have maybe a few in the library here that people gave us in the 19th century. They're very like technical, like what time did you commit this sin? What time was it? What were you thinking in your mind? How did you commit this sin? What hand did you use? What eye position? I mean, there was all these like very. And they were like supposed to ask women questions. I mean, it was very.
What hand did you use? Is that a real thing?
It's like what hand did he use? I mean, well, that could be interpreted in many ways. What hand did he use when he stole the object? What hand did he use when he did this sin? What were you thinking the day before that? I mean, there was like all these strange questions they were trying to like, I guess, figure out. And this all goes back to the casuistry and the Alfonso Ligurian type stuff about how to mitigate the sin. Did you really understand what you were doing, or this or that, or all this other stuff? That's like extremely. That was a lot of the reason people complained about Roman Catholic confession. Not all Roman Catholic confessors did that, but that was allowed, and they kind of encouraged that. But that was a lot of the reasons people complained about Roman Catholic confession, because it was like trying to pry as deep into your personal mind and life about every single thing as possible. When in Orthodoxy, generally, someone has like a special spiritual father or an elder they'll go to, and they'll kind of explain a lot of things, but it never gets into this kind of, you're right, technical manners about.
I will say that.
What did you eat for dinner the night before? Maybe that mitigated how you thought the next day, et cetera, et cetera.
To be fair, Father, usually people under an elder, often that happens, and that's why I generally recommend just going to your regular priest who you go to Mass for.
Yes, no, I agree. But I'm saying is that not all priests have that ability to get that detailed, because if they start getting that detailed, it's going to distract the confession.
It can also lead the priest into sin.
Exactly.
Something that,
and now Metropolitan Anthony Karpovitsky, in a book he wrote on confession, mentions this. This is the priest when he's talking to women, to children, etc. He's got to be very careful on how he questions them, if he has to question them, because he doesn't want to suggest sins to them that they never even heard of or they don't do.
Oh, that reminds me of a very bad joke, which I will not say on this.
Okay, well, we don't need to hear it. Overbeck also mentioned something. Overbeck mentioned something similar. I'm sure he does. I believe I think he does mention this in his book, One of Catholic Orthodoxy, or where he talks about the abuse of the confessional in the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, the confessional was abused so much that you remember they had one Jesuit in the 1600s that supposedly said to somebody, "Well, if the King of France was assassinated because he confiscated some church land from the Pope, it wouldn't be necessarily too bad of a sin if somebody tried to assassinate him." That was one of the reasons the Jesuits got kicked out of France for some time. Yeah. And suppressed, because there was abuse of the confessional in the Roman Catholic Church by these means. But and now my experience in Orthodoxy, and yours could be different, Father, is I've never seen this kind of, and maybe there are people, but I've never seen this kind of abuse of a confessional in the way that it's been described in the Roman Catholic Church. I don't know if there are bad Orthodox cases though.
Not there are bad Orthodox cases. It's not as much. And also the ultimate reason why it's not as much is because the majority of priests who do confessions are married men. And so, in a sense, when dealing with potential temptations, that's part of the reason that they have a spouse. A monastic has the community behind him usually, and they have the closeness to the mystery because they're living the life of the angels. But the point is, a regular diocesan priest who has everyday cares and so on and so forth, who is not married, that's just a minefield of temptations. And that's just assuming that it doesn't, we're not even talking about the gay problem in the Roman Catholic Church, but that compounds it even further. Because I remember when I was young, when I was a Roman Catholic, that used to be a joke. That used to be a common thing. Oh, you're gay? Well, then you should go be a priest. And the point is, Orthodox thinking is completely different. So yes, you'll find occasional bad cases in Orthodoxy, which I have seen, of spiritual abuse, but by and large, the average priest in the average, Orthodox church who's married with kids, or a monk who comes and visits and stuff, is not usually tempted because they usually have spiritual support that you don't usually find in Roman Catholic thinking, and that's part of what motivated the whole crazy moral theology, etc., to try to make it more mathematical to detach the priest from it. But in any case, it turned out to be even more abusive.
And I recall, I should recall bring up the point that in Orthodoxy, confessions a lot of times are heard on Saturday evenings, associated before Vespers or after Vespers. If you're running a mission that has 15, 20, or 30, or let's say even 10 people, or you're having a parish that has like 100 people, and you have to hear like 40, 50 confessions, you're not going to be able to sit there and spend 30 minutes, on 200 people individually. You know what I'm trying to say, Father, right?
Yeah, I do.
So, a lot of times it's like, what are your, that's kind of the thing. What are your sins? Explain your sins. You're not going to go through a very long, complicated, heavily juridicized, bench character.
I'm still a fan of the list. I saw that in Russia, in a ROAC parish. I've heard it's
pointing to your sins on the list.
Yeah. I've heard of bad things that happened with it, like what you mentioned in the Philippines. But the way it used to be done is that you had like a little book, and the book it's all like many pages of the same page. So it was like for your weekly confession, and it went through major sins, so on and so forth. You could write down some explanations. You just checked them off. The priest looked at it. He gave you an absolution. He threw the piece of paper into a little burning. They had like a little garbage can that had a fire in it, and they just burned it out. And it was quick. That's one thing that that is something to remember, that in Orthodoxy, you're not supposed to make it. You can. There's always to talk about spiritual healing as the church is a hospital, and that's fine. But for the average Sunday goer who wants to receive confession, and in this, Father, I have seen in cases where during Matins, a priest will do confessions while people are doing many of the readings. But the point is, it's not supposed to be a long, drawn-out process. You're standing in the front of the church with a bunch of people behind you online. You know your sins. You confess your sins. That's why we say for these sins, known and unknown, because we're not going to get everything.
But I think I should also mention a point that there are, in fact, longer forms, both in the Western and Eastern Rite, of confessions that are not always used, like asking different questions and going through different. And you can find that in some books and things.
You can,
but that's not always used, because oftentimes, if you know the priest and you have kind of a rapport as him as the pastor,
he already knows a lot of things.
Exactly. So you can he kind of knows things, and a priest. To be honest, when a priest hears confessions. And this is what I've been taught, and I don't know if other people have been taught the same thing, and other bishops or whatever. But a priest, when he hears a confession, when it's in the context of confession, while he hears a confession, he cannot act on outside of confession.
Right.
All right. So if somebody in confession, hypothetically, no one's ever done this, not that I could ever say, but hypothetically, if someone said something like, "Father, tonight I was planning on murdering you after Vespers." I don't know. I'm kidding. I'm not. But hypothetically,
stuff like that has happened.
If he says that, and I said, well, look, are you going to do it? And he says, well, I don't know. And I'm going to say, well, look, I'm going to end the confession here. If that's all you're saying, I can't give you absolution. And let's say at that point, I have a choice to make. I can either decide to preserve my priesthood and die, or I can say I'm willing to sacrifice my priesthood and tell somebody, call the police, at which time I have to give up the priesthood. That's basically harsh. That's how seriously things like the confession are supposed to be taken.
Yeah.
Now I should note, he says Mitch von Seraphim Pereus wrote this letter. Yeah, that's true. I think that I would note that there are some things in that letter that Mitch von Seraphim Pereus wrote that I think are suspect, because he says like we don't believe in the bodily assumption of Our Lady, and I'm not sure if by that he's talking about the kind of later Roman Catholic view that the Virgin never died, or that he's denying the concept that the Virgin died, her body was taken to heaven, and it was like kind of reunited with her soul. So, so there was something. Seraphim Pereus says that we don't believe in transubstantiation in that letter also. So some of the stuff he says in that letter, to me, I'm like, why is he saying this? Is he actually kind of trying to be coy and he really means something else, or has he actually got some weird views, heretical views? Hate to bring that up, but that's a question that should be asked. He says, "Thank you for answering a rather flippant question about the 13-year-old boy." Okay,
no problem.
Next question is
well, first off, if any of you have questions right now, please feel free to type them out, because I don't think we have any right now, because I know we covered the usury one that I had for that I got over the weekend. We've covered a few of the other ones, but
well, we're just going to go through the apologetics for war room stuff. That's what I'm going to do.
Well, yeah. Before I made
we got 35 minutes left.
Yeah, before I made my comments about have some candy day. The whole point was we were talking about the context of Halloween and stuff like that. I'm not, I'm of the school, and maybe I'm wrong here, but when it comes to the idea of the celebration of Halloween, and that's part of the reason why I created the whole, have some candy day thing to begin with, is that really there's no good reason for an Orthodox Christian to even bother with it. That's my view. I know some people will.
Did you what? I didn't hear what you said.
They even bother with it. Some people will. A lot of it's social.
I mean, the problem is this: it's not just some silly day in which people dress up as pirates, and they kind of it's not just costume day. That's the problem.
Well, maybe we can do costume day too.
Yeah, well, but the problem is this: is that that a lot of the stuff. I think a lot of the stuff about trying to make it more about demons and dressing up as monsters and horror movies and all this other stuff, that seems to have been late 19th, maybe there. I was talking to someone a few days ago, and I asked him, you were growing up in the 40s and the 50s. What do you remember, like in Union City, New Jersey, people doing for Halloween? And he said, well, somebody would dress up as a hobo, somebody would dress it up as a pirate, but no one dressed up as something demonic or anything.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not still endorsing it then, but you can see there was some kind of a shift that transpired with it. And, part of it, I think, is that, originally what we call Halloween was kind of the Western, ancient Western day, Vigil of All Saints, All Hallows Eve, the eve or the Vigil of All Saints Day. All right. And then you had, All Saints, and then you had the All Souls Day after All Saints on November 2nd. Of course, we would use it on the old calendar. Right. But once everything became secularized, once, you had Protestantism come in, and, gradually, they lost any kind of concept of connection to the communion of saints. Yeah, well, remember also, in Protestantism, there is no communion of the saints in any real substantial sense, because you can't pray for the departed, nor can you pray to the saints. All right? So what happens is that, that breaks a major, even papism was heretical, but it still kind of kept that concept. But once that concept is lost, and then you have America, which was heavily even more Protestantized than England, in many ways, and then you have American secularism and commercialism come in, and then you have the loss of religiosity, and with the attendant loss of Christian religiosity, there came in a fascination with occult and New Age stuff, which we see with Madame Blavatsky even in the mid and late 19th century.
Yeah. All
right, the whole theosophy stuff. And that just has this downward spiral where they can take something that was originally meant to commemorate the Vigil of All Saints, and they could, let's say, transmogrify it into something totally contrary to what it was originally meant to be.
Well, it's like the Easter Bunny all over again. I mean, the whole point is the idea of the fertility rituals, so on and so forth. A lot of that is just mixed up, and then they try to say the rabbit was part of it.
Well, the rabbit was not. You know why the Easter Bunny comes from? It comes from the fact that after the Lent was over,
40 days of Lent, yeah.
Yeah, people ate rabbit because a lot of people couldn't afford turkey or deer. Rabbit was an easier animal to catch and to eat.
Just for the record, for Pascha, I'm totally endorsing an Easter bunny. He belongs in the center of your table.
Yes, poor bunny.
Well, he's not. He doesn't mind. He's going to be eaten anyway. It's like, do we feel bad for the turkey on Thanksgiving?
What is also like, for example, if you read some of the wiki articles, all these other online articles about, the origin of the pagan festival of this and that. A lot of this stuff is at best half truths. Like they were trying to point out that on Vigil of All Saints. Of course, this is still the new calendar date. Up in the 1700s in the Hebrides Islands, and which is Western Scotland, Western Ireland, I can't remember. There was a ceremony in which the people somebody would come out with like a glass of wine or ale, and they would pour it into the ocean, and they would say something like, "O holy Seonad, we pray that thou wouldst give us more, seaweed for our harvest." And then you go into the church and they would pray. And there was this attempt to say by the kind of like the Puritans to say, you see, this is like the paganism that was never extinguished, blah, blah, blah. Well, Seonad, or the word Seoniade, and I think in ancient Irish was in fact another word for Saint John. And this was not in fact any kind of pagan survival. There was no prayer to the sea god. What was actually happened is there was an ancient tradition of what's called Saint John's ale or Saint John's wine, which was blessed wine. And the concept is just like holy water. People would sprinkle it on crops or in the river, and they would pray that the seaweed, which was used for fertilizer, would, by the prayers of St. John and the holy wine, wash up on shore, and they would have a good harvest. But later you had some, Protestant guy come out there, Puritan in the 1700s, say, you see, they're praying to the ancient Celtic sea god, which is not true. Seonad was another word for St. John. And then, kind of these neo-Wiccans in the 20th century kind of find this guy. Exactly. And they create, you see, people were still worshiping the ancient pagan gods. And, this is it's just like the whole December 21st, the Christmas was originally, the pagan festival, when in fact the evidence from St. Hippolytus and others was kind of the exact opposite. There's a decrees of the Roman emperors that wanted to pick December, that wanted to establish a feast of Sol Invictus to counter, guess what? The Christian festival. All right. So, a lot of this the problem is this: you're always going to find some sort of parallels that are just going to be natural parallels that exist between pagan and Christian festivals, because pagan festivals in some ways are expressions of fallen expressions of concepts that are in the human mind of sorts. For example, it's like going into the Old Testament and saying, well, look at the Levitical rituals. The priest wears vestments. Well, the pagan priest wears vestments. So does that mean the Old Testament priests got the wearing of vestments from pagan ceremonies?
It simply means that the concept.
Or was it the exact opposite? The pagan ceremonies are corruptions of the original priesthood. You know what I mean?
And that's one of the things you have to consider, is that the more you research into these alleged ties and you look for primary source material, the links between Christian feasts and these alleged pagan holidays, so on and so forth, become more and more tenuous.
Because even November 1st, October 31st, on the old calendar really, but even if you don't use the new calendar date, that is the midpoint between the autumn equinox and the winter solstice or something like that, which was a day observed throughout the world for many reasons, because it was kind of like an astronomical, midpoint. And in technically monastic winter, in the West, at least in the pre-season West, going back to St. Benedict, was around early November, too.
In other words, it was so Pennsylvania's weather is basically monastic winter?
Yeah, well, the monastic winter is begins in early November on the old calendar for us. But that goes back to St. Benedict. And St. Benedict talked about it as a normal thing. So that was how people marked the seasons. So the problem is that pagans and Wiccans, and even Wiccan stuff is kind of invented.
Oh, yeah.
They know all this stuff. They kind of tried to say, this was an ancient pagan day. Well, this was an ancient pagan day. If everything becomes pagan, then nothing's pagan. There's really no way to distinguish between anything.
I think it was the pagan writer, I forget, I think it was Cunningham, the neo-pagan writer, basically arguing that all of the sources that they all basically came from Gardner, and they were all basically made up. And I think he kind of admits it, and he's just like, we just got to go with it anyway.
Yeah, it's like who's the name of that guy that pseudo fake Egyptologist in the 19th century.
Joseph Smith.
Yeah, no, he's the other one. He was like, oh, there's Jesus was based off of Osiris and Anup the Baptizer,
Manley,
and
I think it's Gerald Manley. I think
Gerald Massey.
Okay.
And it was he just made everything up. And they re-quote this stuff like what in that zeitgeist stuff, and it's like there's no evidence for any of this, but they just say it. And
all it takes is one dank meme.
And if you can control the Wikipedia page, you can basically run anything. Because you look at all these quotes, they're like quoting neo-pagan writers or you go to some YouTube, Google Books, and it's like written by some pagan, and like, where's the source material in this? And it's just like it's just a requotation of everybody else. That's the same thing I found out when you did these studies about Gennadius and Damasus and the Filioque in manuscripts. Everybody's like, Damasus taught the Filioque.
Elaborate a little on this, because not everyone knows.
Well, for example, you find this. I did a video on my traditional Western Orthodox channel, kind of about this. But
subscribe to it.
Yeah, exactly. So subscribe if you want to. So somebody would quote saying that Damasus taught the Filioque in the 390s or 380s. Pope Saint Damasus. Well, where does it say that? Well, there's one guy in one book who says. Well, okay. Well, who said it? For example, what's his name? The guy Siasinski, who wrote like on the Filioque, a history or whatever, and like yeah. Well, he quotes some like early 20th century, late 19th century writers, and then if you look at their sources material, and they're kind of quoting each other, and then if you kind of track some of them down, one of them quotes the Patrologia, but the problem is that you can't necessarily trust the Patrologia, and you can't necessarily trust Denzinger. People who say, well, we got to go with Denzinger. Denzinger at one point had the Filioque in the Nicene Creed.
Really?
I mean, yeah, exactly. At one point, I think of like early 1850s edition, and they had then they had to put it in brackets, and they're like, well, I mean, eventually after Denzinger died, they kind of started putting things in italics and brackets, which means it's not in the original text.
I actually got into a fight when I was in college with a religion professor because it was in the textbook she was using. So I guess they were using Denzinger. And it was supposed.
Denzinger has the Enchiridion does have interesting stuff that you can for source material, but you got to check other sources. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, but my point was that when I brought this up to the professor, I said, okay, first off, because it said it was the symbol at Nicaea, and it was the entire Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed.
Exactly.
I was like, okay, well, first off, the Filioque wasn't in there, and second off, this is the Creed of Constantinople, not the Creed of Nicaea, and so the professor was adamant. Absolutely adamant. And I was a Uniate back then. You're absolutely wrong. And I was like, no, I'm not. Because, I was young, but I knew the history. And the point is, it really took 3 or 4 tries. And finally, I got an apology like 2 days later. And then I dropped out of the class because I thought this was ridiculous. But the point is, people will believe fully what they read if they're not careful. The most important thing you can do is always, and I hate to say this, because we are a people of faith. Orthodox people are a people of faith. The church always is. But we also have to maintain a level of skepticism, especially when people are talking about Christianity and it does not come from the fathers of the church. You've got to look at the sources. You've got to question.
Well, what happens is people don't want to do that because it's easier to read an article about something to actually read the father. And that's the major problem people have, the attention span issue. I don't know if is it really a fault? I don't blame it on attention span. I blame it on bad information. A lot of bad information. Maybe a combination of both.
Well, if you go to 10 books and you're trying to read about the history of the Filioque, the vast majority of them will have the 589 dating at the Synod of Toledo. They will adamantly state that the Filioque was held throughout the West up until the 11th century. But we know for a fact that's not true. But because it's repeated so often, I hate to say this, and this is really the big battle that is going to have to happen for Orthodox apologists in general. We need to answer all the bad data because the truth of the matter is there's so much out there. We were talking about the invention of the papacy literally 4 or 5 weeks ago. And then I noticed that there was a discussion on the War Zone where it was as if it never happened. And we were talking about 589 again and the gradual estrangement theory, which isn't true. And the point is, because there's so much bad data out there that when we say something like Hildebrand invented the Roman Catholic Church, people are like, well, that sounds interesting. Totally forget it because it doesn't mesh with the data. There's no cognitive dissonance. And we have to hammer forth the facts. And that's harder than...
Let me give you an example. The whole thing about St. Isidore of Seville taught the Filioque. And, you know, this is a big issue that has to be researched because people can say, well, what about his De Differentiis Rerum or, you know, his De Etymologia, etc., or whatever. Well, as soon as I begin to see, if you look in, like, for example, and I don't know how I got to looking about this. I don't quite remember why I was interested in this subject. But I may have... What happened was that I was like, well, let me start looking at St. Isidore of Seville and the sources for him teaching the Filioque. And if you look in, for example, in his book 2 of his De Differentiis Rerum, or concerning the differences of things, Differentia Prima in section 3 called Inter Personam, you can find that in Patrologia Latina, volume 83. What we find in Patrologia Latina, volume 83 is Spiritus Sanctus, nec factus, nec natus, sed ex patre filioque percidens est. Or in other words, the Patrologia makes St. Isidore say, the Holy Ghost neither made nor begotten, or born, but from the Father and Son he is proceeding. Okay, well, however, in many medieval manuscripts, it doesn't say that at all. All it says is, guess what? Spiritus vero sanctus, nec factus, nec natus, sed ex patre procedens est. The Holy Ghost in truth neither made nor begotten, but from the Father he is proceeding. All right. In fact, if you go, that says that, and I've got the manuscript here, to BNF Gallica, which is the French National Library. My dogs are trying to bark at each other. The manuscript is... I can't get the image, the actual information. I'll post it, just for sake of it. But if you look at the next section in this late manuscript, this like 10th century manuscript, then it has Saint Isidore saying, "Ser Spiritus Vero Sanctus ex Patre Filioque proceeded." So it looks like, oh well, he's not teaching the Filioque in the first section, but suddenly he begins to teach it in the second. All right. Well, you know what's happened here. And this is what I go through in one of my articles, is that if you look at an earlier manuscript, you see that somebody wrote, instead of Spiritus Veri Sanctus ex Patre Filioque proceeded, they wrote, you see is Spiritus Veri Sanctus ex Patre Filioque proceeded. You know why Patre Filioque Patre is repeated twice? Because in an earlier manuscript, someone wrote Patre Filioque in the margin. And then the next scholar who copied it for that second part just didn't know why it was there. He just copied it because the original text, even that second part, simply read Spiritus Vere Sanctus ex Patre proceeded. All right. So if there were these little things you can, like editing things, that if you began to examine manuscripts and begin to look, you begin to say, look, somebody messed up, someone interpolated a manuscript. Yeah. All right. And you can begin to think, well, this is the same thing with and I have not done a tremendous amount of research in it, but this is something similar with what's sometimes called the kind of the pseudo, how do you say, the pseudo Bonifacian homilies that are sometimes attributed to Saint Boniface, where the whole homily is like everything is correct. And there's no Holy Ghost proceeding from the Father and the Son. But then out of nowhere, there's like this appended phrase that's like, why is it attached here with ex filio? After St. Boniface already says ex patre procedens, then suddenly is written ex filio. Why is that? Now, my theory, without having gone in, and it's very difficult to find all these manuscripts, but I'm getting gradually better at it, is simply someone just wrote that in a marginal note who thought, well, that should be there, when it really wasn't. All right. And the result is then people end up attacking St. Isidore 1,000 years, 13 years, 100 years later, and taking him off the church calendar. And they did that Hockna thing, I'll be frank, and they never did any research, and they committed a grave, horrific blasphemy because they just read it in a book. and they didn't want to do any research. If you're going to take a saint off the calendar who's been on the calendar for about 1,400 years, and you're not going to do manuscript research, then you got to answer before the judgment of God, and that's going to be a terrible judgment indeed.
Well, this all ties into the whole St. Augustine thing. He was always in the calendar.
But they took St. Isidore off, and without even realizing that there were lies made about him.
Yeah, but the point is that the truth can also be said about St. Augustine. But my point is, it was a slippery slope, because I spoke to one of the monks at HTM at that time, and he explained, we had a Synodia meeting and took him off. Once you start taking one saint off the calendar, you declare yourself to have the power to remove a saint that's in the canons of the ecumenical councils. Well, it's all a slippery slope from there. From there, you could just be like, we don't like this saint. I read somewhere he might be a heretic. And it's terrible. It's the rise of bad information.
It's like the attempt to say they took Saint Dunstan. They said they're not going to put Saint Dunstan or recognize him as a saint, because the argument was that according to one late 11th century life, which could be true, I don't think it's wrong. There was a case in which there were two counterfeiters who were scheduled to have their hands cut off, like on the day after Pentecost or something like that. All right. And St. Dunstan, when he was informed about this, he said, no, they should have their hands cut off, because what they have done has caused the starvation of multitudes of people. Counterfeiting coins and charging interest was actually considered horrific in the 10th century in England, the 11th century, because you could actually turn an old lady from having, all right enough money to survive to suddenly she doesn't have anything and she starves to death. All right. And St. Dunstan, according to this life, insists that their hands be cut off according to the judgment that there was given to them by the king. And then when he's celebrating Mass at Pentecost, an orb of light is shown shining over his head. Now, St. Dunstan wept great tears that these men had to be punished. And some of these kind of renovationist people were saying, this shows this man is not a saint. No saint could do that. Well,
he didn't kill him.
He didn't kill him, but I should make another point. Why is it that the Patriarch of Constantinople in the 790s, who was, as I recall, Patriarch, is it Nicephorus? Yes, Patriarch St. Nicephorus of Constantinople, in the history, in one of the primary sources of the time, basically demanded that Manichaean heretics be executed. He demanded not just criminals be punished on Sunday, but that Manichaean heretics be executed. Now, St. Theodore the Student was like, you shouldn't do this, just exile them. You shouldn't execute people for heresy, because you're depriving the chance to repent. They should be excommunicated and expelled, or even if they're not part of the church, they should just be, removed to another village or whatever. All right? But no one has ever thought to take St. Nicephorus off the calendar because he demanded some harsh punishment. Now, what's worse, demanding a heretic be executed and thus depriving him of the chance to repent, or asking that two counterfeiters involved in depriving and murdering a lot of people have their hand cut off on a Sunday?
Yeah, no, I would say the same.
To me, that you see, it's a double standard, and people don't really look at this or think about this. They just react because, this is like a Western saint from the year 990, and he wore a Western mitre, so therefore he's not really Orthodox. We know that, supposedly. It's ridiculous. They don't have any understanding of Orthodoxy, even if they claim that they're Orthodox.
Well, now it's interesting because the next two questions, in some sense, kind of relate to that, but. The first one, what is the clearest pre-schism patristic writing on essence and energy?
Lateran Synod 649.
Okay, elaborate.
The Lateran Synod of 649 was originally organized by Pope St. Theodore. Pope St. Theodore, I think, died around the year, he was 102 when he died. And St. Martin, I think, who was, was an archdeacon or maybe a priest. He was elected his successor, and he was consecrated, made a priest, and then made a bishop, made a Pope of Rome. And he collaborated with St. Maximus the Confessor, who at that time, I think, had fled North Africa and gone into Italy. All right. And St. Maximus the Confessor had collaborated with St. Theodore and St. Martin to push together kind of a council. And the council was called the Lateran Synod of 649. And it was originally intended to be an ecumenical council. I mean, everybody there thought it was ecumenical, although it was never accepted. It kind of had almost like a pan-Orthodox council understanding.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But it was, the popes and other bishops in the West had continuously condemned the Monothelite and Monergist heresy since the death of Honorius. All right. Now, that's an interesting question about Honorius. I mean, he is condemned, so we're not going to exonerate him. But there was kind of this attempt by people like Pope St. John IV and others, for whatever reason, to kind of say, well, we're still going to condemn this, but, we're not going to really talk a lot about Honorius because it was kind of an embarrassing thing. But they were condemning it, and they were like, we're not in communion with Constantinople. And I think what was happening is people were saying, well, there's no council, so can you condemn a heresy without a council? So they thought, well, we've already condemned it, but let's just hold a council anyway. I think they had held actually smaller councils in Rome in the early 640s or whatever, condemning monothelitism.
Yeah.
So they hold a council, and at this council, you can find Richard Price's translation of this you can buy it for like $35, I guess, from Liverpool University. But don't buy. I would recommend buying the softback edition. Don't buy the hardback edition. You don't really want to pay $100. It's not really worth it. I mean, to get a softback that's the same text, and in it we have various speeches by the different saints about this issue. Now, Price tries to argue that really St. Maximus wrote the Acts and none of these Western fathers said anything, but I don't believe that. Pope St. Martin spoke Greek just as well as he spoke Latin. He was not an ignorant man. He suffered tremendous torture and terror for what he believed in. And if you read the encyclical letter of the council and the epistle of St. Martin to the emperor, he clearly teaches that in our Lord there is an uncreated operation of his divinity, or energy, operatio, that's the Latin word for energia in Greek, and there is a created operation of his humanity. Okay? So he is saying that, guess what? God has an uncreated operation. In fact, this is implicit. Stop. My dogs are barking. See, this is in fact implicit in diotheletism, which is the Orthodox position of there being two wills and two energies. All right? So I think the clearest exposition you're going to find is the Lateran Synod. And this was approved officially by Pope St. Martin and all the bishops there. So that contains dogmatic statements in its epistle that were...
Which were the energies.
Yes.
So I think that ultimately the clearest precism patristic writing on the essence and energy distinctions comes from Pope St. Martin and the Lateran Synod.
Yes. Okay, so another question. Justice for Orthodox, is any cleric in the Orthodox Metropolitan ever consider reviving the Trinity Celtic style of iconography? Well, first of all, we'd have to find. I can't really make icon. I'm not really good at iconography.
I wanted to touch this question.
Okay.
First off, my wife is an iconographer. Hello, if she's listening.
Father Joseph. Father Joseph.
Yes.
Right there. Continue talking. I'll be back in 30 seconds. Okay.
Okay, it's fine. My wife is an iconographer. She learned in the Holy Eucharist. And one of the things that interested her when we were doing the Mozarabic rite was the iconography of the Hispanic Church. And in looking at the Book of Kells, I find that there are a number of similarities that you can adduce from the Book of Kells and from Mozarabic iconography also. Precism, Western iconography. The eyes are larger. The fingers are considerably longer, and again, I'm not just throwing this out to my wife here because she's not in the room, but the point is that there are things that are unique to Western and Celtic and Old Spanish styles of iconography. The biggest problem that you have is that iconography it requires training and it requires copying. Iconography is copied. When we start seeing clerics and we start seeing other iconographers copying these old traditional Western forms, they'll be able to apply them to other saints. And that is something that hopefully and God willing does happen. There is one iconographer, I believe his name is Aidan Hart, in the Moscow Patriarchate, and if you look at some of his icons, they don't look like Byzantine icons because he's trying to revive the Western style. It looks like he's reviving more of the West or East Roman style of the 6th century that you do find in a lot of icons. But
like the Sinai style, the style right. You see at Sinai,
exactly.
For example? Okay.
But, take it one step further. I'd say this, if an iconographer wants to restore that traditional Celtic style of iconography, they need to copy those old Celtic icons. They need to copy the Book of Kells, and when they can do it well enough, then they can apply it to another saint. Just like you do with the Byzantine icons, no Byzantine iconographer just suddenly has a gift for drawing people in that fascinating style that we have.
Yeah, iconography is not innovationism.
Right, you have to practice it. And so if anyone was interested in doing that, and I'm not just saying in the Metropolia, in any synod, any True Orthodox synod or any synod, they have to practice. And they have to do that style.
And I think it should be pointed out that if you look at, to address another issue kind of related, if you look at iconography that was in Italy, in parts of France and in Bavaria and Switzerland, for example, it's basically, and oftentimes it's very hard to distinguish, is this Byzantine iconography or is it just or is it something slightly different? If you know what I mean. Well, because for example, the iconographic tradition that was very prominent in Italy and parts in France, and in, let's say, parts of Germany, was very, very close.
It was basically the Roman Byzantine style.
Yes, it was a large, and even you look at some of the surviving images we have on some churches, old Anglo-Saxon churches. They kind of imitated this as well.
Yeah, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But these other styles, if you want to revive them, you have to do it like an iconographer. And I'm not an iconographer, but I do know enough iconographers to know that means you have to practice those styles.
Yes. I mean, to be honest, the traditional, what we might call the Roman iconographic style, by that I mean East and West Roman, Byzantine, Italian, and such, that's kind of the easiest. If you're going to buy large icon prints to put on your walls and to plaster up there, that's going to be the cheapest thing. You're not going to have to make a specialty order. You know what I mean?
No, I understand that, but I think the person is asking about reviving, since Justice is mentioning reviving the traditional Celtic style, then you have to practice the traditional Celtic style.
I think there actually have been a few people that have actually done that. There was one Antiochian group church that did. I mean, they're not true Orthodox, but they did do that. I saw one. There have been people attempting to do that every now and again.
Well, I did see this. Yeah, there was actually, I will say this, there was an Antiochian church. It was a Western Rite church, and they did a Pantocrator in the Spanish style. And that was impressive. When I saw it, I was like, wow, that actually looks right.
So you can find people doing that. And I mean, in our Metropolia, again, you're going to have to find iconographers that are going to be willing to heavily practice this.
Yeah.
But, the thing is in a lot of synods, to Orthodox synods, sometimes you have people who, you have a few iconographers and they're kind of overworked for what they're,
they're expensive.
Exactly. Because you're going to be doing this as your life, as your livelihood. Because if you want to revive an iconographic style, you have to start practicing it yourself. Then you have to start teaching other people how to repeat it correctly.
Well, I mean,
and that takes a lot of time.
Well, it's not actually the responsibility of the iconographer. It's just doing the style. But the point is, it will be expensive to do that. You'd have to find somebody who loves the tradition, who's willing to, say in the Celtic case, to practice using the iconography that was found, and it's a lot of work. So
I think it will happen eventually.
It'll happen eventually, and it probably won't be cheap. And people will be like, "Oh, I'll just buy a print." But if you really want to see that, revived, you've got to commission it. It's that simple. All right, we
got about 3 minutes left to fill up the time. Somebody asked on the forum where to find Adam von Zernikov's Tractatus Theologicae Orthodoxi de Processione Spiritus Sancti Asilo Patri. You can find it on Google Books, in fact. So no need to, unless you want to make another print or to order it from a rare books from a public library. Just go to Google Books.
And you can actually print on demand
print on demand. Absolutely. You'll probably get it cheaper than you can get it from Amazon, from someone buying it from someone on Amazon or something like that. There's unfortunately no current English. There is no English translation I know of. I think I may be the only person that's translated a few sections of it into English for a few things I've written. The problem is unfortunately there was in fact a lot of interest in von Zernikov's writings in Russia, but because in fact you find that a lot of the 18th and early 19th century Russian Orthodox theological tracts against the Filioque kind of pro forma, almost word for word, repeated Zernikov's points. But after and I think there was, in fact, there were, in fact, a number of Russian Orthodox apologists writing things on this in the late 19th century. We don't really know about them anymore. But once the, revolution happens, everybody doesn't care about this stuff anymore. Then you get ecumenism, you get modernism, you get apathy. Apologetics is looked down upon as kind of reactionary. Then even among some of the traditionalists, true Orthodox, they don't, I've encountered it from some of them where they think, oh, you shouldn't do apologetics. It demonstrates a lack of faith somehow to do apologetics, So, Father Michael Pomazansky makes a very good mention of Vern Zernikoff, that he wrote a very good book against the Filioque, and that's the only way most people are ever going to encounter anything about von Zernikoff, unfortunately. Because nowadays people would just consider him obscurantist, if you know what I mean.
Well, that's my point. Where I hate
just like they consider Overbeck obscurantist.
But the point is, all Orthodox apologists are obscurantists. So I guess this is about the rise of the obscurantists, and
exactly.
We are Obscurantists Incorporated. So we're going to keep on bringing this and going forward.
Orthodoxy against everybody.
And speaking of which, do not forget to subscribe if you are not already a subscriber. We are going to be adding more programs. I might not be on all the hours. Father Enoch has kindly volunteered to work on that. But we're doing Orthodoxy versus everyone, which means all those questions that are not apologetics related that you want to ask about Orthodoxy, but you didn't have the gall to ask your local priest. We're going to answer them. And we also have the Western Orthodox podcast where we're going to be talking about Western Orthodoxy, the Western Rite, the pre-schism services, what we are using today, and even more. So there's a lot going on. So again, like and subscribe. Father, if you were in the beginning of the chat, traditional Western Orthodoxy, like and subscribe, because that's where we're going to be doing the Western Orthodox podcast. And for the other two, well, if this is a podcast, I still really don't know. The point is, we're going to keep on doing these live casts. We're going to do a lot more, and we're going to be reaching out to more people. Okay.
Well, most of the videos are going to be here on the Apologetics channel, and only one of them.
2 out of 3.
2 out of 3. So,
but that's still
okay. So the concept is we're going to be doing one Tuesday night, another Thursday night, and another Saturday night.
Yes, and so ultimately, that means you're going to be
8 o'clock, same time.
All right, sounds good. Gute Nacht, fathers. Good night. Have a great evening. Well, I can't say God bless. That's your job, Father.
Okay. The Lord bless.
Okay. Have a good night.
All right. Good night.